In 1928, a woman named Catherine Donahue, one of the Radium girls, had her jawbone literally disintegrate due to radiation poisoning, leaving her with a gaping hole in her face that would eventually kill her. And this was just the beginning of the horrific consequences of a job that seemed harmless at first. Painting watch faces with glowing radium. Hundreds of women were employed to paint the faces of watches and clocks with this radioactive substance, unaware of the deadly risks they were taking. And it would take years of suffering and fighting for justice to expose the truth. The company, United States Radium, had assured them it was safe, even encouraged them to moisten their brushes with their tongues to get a finer point. And this small act would seal their fate. But here's where it gets dark. The women were not just painting watches. They were essentially painting their own death sentences. And it would take a few brave ones to stand up and demand change. The story begins in Orange, New Jersey, in 1917, where the United States Radium Company had set up a factory to produce glow-in-the-dark watches for the military, and they needed a lot of workers to meet the demand. So they hired hundreds of young women, mostly teenagers, to paint the watch faces with radium. The women were thrilled to have a job, especially one that paid well and seemed so glamorous. But little did they know, they were being slowly poisoned with every brushstroke. The radium would cause their bones to disintegrate, their teeth to fall out, and their jaws to rot. And it would take years for the effects to show up. But when they did, it was too late. Nobody talks about this part. But the women were so proud of their work. They would even paint their nails and faces with the leftover radium, thinking it was a harmless novelty. And this is where everything fell apart. As the years went by, the women began to fall ill, one by one. And at first, it seemed like a coincidence. But soon it became clear that something was terribly wrong. They would experience excruciating pain. Their bones would break easily. And they would suffer from anemia. And still, the company denied any wrongdoing. The women were told it was just their imagination, or that they were suffering from some unknown disease. But the truth was, they were being slowly killed by the very substance they were working with. In 1924, a woman named Margaret Carlo, one of the Radium girls, had her leg amputated due to radiation poisoning. And this was just the beginning of the horrific consequences that would unfold. The women were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for justice. And it would take a few brave ones to take on the company and demand change. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn, as the women, led by Catherine Donahue, decided to take matters into their own hands and sue the company. The lawsuit, which began in 1928, would be a long and brutal fight, with the company using every trick in the book to discredit the women and deny any responsibility. The women were subjected to humiliating medical exams, and their characters were smeared in the press. But they refused to back down. They had the support of the labor unions, and some brave doctors who were willing to testify on their behalf. But the company had deep pockets and a team of lawyers who would stop at nothing to win. The women's health was deteriorating rapidly, and they knew they had to act fast, or they would all be dead before the case was even heard. Nobody talks about this part, but the women had to fight not just the company, but also the sexism and misogyny that permeated every level of society. And it would take a monumental effort to overcome these obstacles. The case would drag on for years, with the women facing one setback after another. But they refused to give up. And this is where the story becomes even more shocking. As the case progressed, it became clear that the company had known about the dangers of radium all along, and had deliberately hid the truth from the women. They had done experiments on animals, and had seen the devastating effects of radiation poisoning. But they had chosen to ignore the evidence and prioritize profits over people. The women were not just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for all workers. And their case would have far-reaching consequences for labor laws and women's rights. In 1938, the case finally went to trial, and the women won a major victory, with the company being forced to pay them compensation for their suffering. But here's where it gets even darker. The company had already moved on to other victims, exploiting workers in other factories. And it would take years of campaigning to get the government to pass new laws to protect workers from radiation poisoning. And this is where the story becomes even more tragic. The Radium Girls case would change labor laws forever, with the government being forced to introduce new regulations to protect workers from radiation poisoning. The women's fight for justice had not been in vain, and their legacy would live on, inspiring future generations of workers to stand up for their rights. In 1949, the U.S. government passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which included provisions to protect workers from radiation poisoning. And this was a direct result of the Radium Girls case. The women had fought and died for this moment, and their sacrifice would never be forgotten. And this is where the story becomes even more poignant, as we remember the women who lost their lives, and the ones who survived to tell the tale. The Radium Girls story is a testament to the power of courage and determination, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for change. The aftermath of the Radium Girls case was a long and difficult one, with many of the women struggling to come to terms with what had happened to them. Some would never fully recover from the effects of radiation poisoning, and would spend the rest of their lives in pain and suffering. But others would go on to become advocates for workers' rights, using their experience to help others who had been exploited and abused. The Radium Girls' legacy would live on, inspiring future generations of workers to stand up for their rights, and to never give up in the face of adversity. And this is where the story becomes even more powerful, as we realize that the Radium Girls' fight for justice was not just about them, but about all workers, and their right to a safe and healthy work environment. The Radium Girls' story is a dark and tragic one, but it is also a story of hope and resilience, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way forward. In the end, the Radium Girls' story is a testament to the power of the human spirit, and a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, we can make a difference. The women's fight for justice would change labor laws forever, and their legacy would live on, inspiring future generations of workers to stand up for their rights. And this is where the story comes full circle, as we remember the women who lost their lives, and the ones who survived to tell the tale. The Radium Girls' story is a dark and tragic one, but it is also a story of hope and resilience, and a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. So if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe for more dark history.